My name is Jonathan Poritz. I've retired from two careers over many years, one as a professor of mathematics and computer science, another in parallel working in various companies and research centers on cryptology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computation. These days, I think of myself as a gig worker in the open education movement.
And my name is Kathy Giuffre. I'm a retired professor of sociology. I spent 30 years researching and teaching about communities, networks, social movements, and collective action.
It often seems like today the world is going through a kind of slow apocalypse, with genocidal violence, devastating climate change, global pandemic, and on and on and on, all horribly exacerbated by an awful rightward trend in politics in so many nations. As people who want to do something to make the world a better place, we have found it hard not to despair. But then we remembered that our various careers and lives have given us tools which we find useful and which we hope may be useful to you as we try to resist the slide into dystopia.
Today I want to talk about small acts of resistance. We're up against people who can buy countries and governments and the President of the United States for what is their pocket change. But that doesn't mean that every act of resistance has to come equally well funded. As a matter of fact, we will never be equally well funded. The acts of resistance that are small, though, shouldn't be discounted. Yes, big organizations matter, but small acts of resistance can actually have a larger effect than we imagine. So to understand this, I want to talk about a book called Weapons of the Weak by James Scott, a political scientist. And what Scott did was he spent 2 years, 1978 through 1980, in a town in Malaysia that he called Sedaka. That's not its real name. And what he was doing was he was looking at how the small-scale farmers and agricultural laborers responded to changes in rice farming methods, including the introduction of huge combine harvesters in 1976. So that really affected the way they lived their lives, their livelihoods. And these changes meant that the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, but the residents of Sedaka fought back, not in organized, direct confrontational ways that could have been actually suicidal in that case, but with what Scott called weapons of the weak.
I like that we're looking at a broader cultural context. We're not just looking at wealthy white Westerners. We're looking in different cultures and different people.
Yeah, it's great because we often may think from my Western perspective, how much could I learn from rice farmers in Malaysia? And the answer is a lot, a huge amount. We don't have to reinvent the wheel of resistance every time. A lot of people have been resisting a lot of oppression for a long time, and they have lessons to teach us. So the first question is, what does this mean, weapons of the weak? What are they? So here's a quote from Scott. What we might call everyday forms of peasant resistance, the prosaic but constant struggle between the peasantry and those who seek to extract labor, food, taxes, rents, and interest from them. Most of the forms this struggle takes stop well short of collective outright defiance. Here I have in mind the ordinary weapons of relatively powerless groups: foot-dragging, dissimulation, false compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, arson, sabotage, and so forth.
Yeah, that word peasant just jumped out at me in that quote. It sticks a little bit. It seems like it's not respecting people as much to call them peasants, but actually, if you think about it, the workers in many contexts and many societies, the wealthy and less wealthy countries in the world today, are maybe properly thought of as peasants.
Well, I think, Scott wrote this book in 1985. Today, we probably wouldn't use the word peasants. We would say small-scale agricultural laborers. But that's the word he used, so that's the word I'm using here. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the situation they were in mirrors very closely the situation that a lot of us are in today. We may or may not be working in rice fields, but we also may be working in Amazon warehouses, for example, or for that matter, more and more in schools, in hospitals, in cities, in the West rather than rice fields in Malaysia, but the situation is remarkably similar. And the same sort of pressures are remarkably similar. That is, people feel like they can't fight back against these powerful oligarchs, for example, against powerful bosses, because their subsistence, their livelihood is at stake here. And that's how the people in Sedaka also felt, that outright confrontation was in fact a suicidal gesture, because all of the power lay in the hands of the big landlords and the big corporations. The same way we feel today. What can we do against people who are so overwhelming?
Yeah, that also reminds me of a great book by the author, it's a novel by the author Douglas Coupland called Microserfs, which is about the sort of treating tech workers as peasantry of a kind.
Exactly. So we'll put a link to that in the information about this video. But I want to pull up another quote from Scott here, because what he says is, "It is rare for peasants to risk an outright confrontation with the authorities, because that is just too dangerous. Instead, they are likely to nibble away at oppressive policies by non-compliance, foot-dragging, deception. In place of a land invasion, they prefer piecemeal squatting. In place of open mutiny, they prefer desertion. In place of attacks on public or private grain stores, they prefer pilfering. When such stratagems are abandoned in favor of more quixotic action, it is usually a sign of great desperation."
Okay, but why are these particular ways the best way to approach?
Well, there are a couple of different reasons. And the first one, here's another quote from Scott. The first one is this: "These Brechtian forms of class struggle have certain features in common. They require little or no coordination or planning. They make use of implicit understandings and informal networks. They often represent a form of individual self-help. They typically avoid any direct symbolic confrontation with authority." So that's one reason why they work really well. They don't require coordination planning. They're easy to do. You don't have to have a big organization with a lot of resources to engage in this sort of behavior. Your informal networks are enough. You don't have to plan some big thing and have a lot of meetings and set agendas. You can do them very informally. They're easy, they're quick and easy to do. So that's one thing.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that I've been involved in the last several years, which is called the open education movement. People in the United States, the textbooks for students in higher education in the United States have become insanely expensive, and it's very hard to work around those systems. But individual professors can say, hey, I'm not going to require my students to buy this incredibly expensive book, or maybe it's even officially the required book, but you can say to your students, don't buy this book. I'm handing out free, or I'm giving you a link to a free book that I have created or that other people I know have created. So I always tell my colleagues working in this area, here's the thing you can do that is good, that you don't need to organize. You just do it on your own, and it is good in the community you are working in. You don't need to coordinate with anyone else. It's good that no one can stop you from doing.
Right, and that is a way of resisting the kind of corporate oppression that we see in academia, where students are being, especially in the United States, buried under student debt because of things like not only the cost of tuition, but the cost of textbooks. So it's an individual action that can directly address that. And then there's a second reason why these actions can be so effective. And so I'm pulling up another quote from Scott. "This is a social movement with no formal organization, no formal leaders, no manifestos, no dues, no name, and no banner. By virtue of their institutional invisibility, activities on anything less than a massive scale, if they are noticed at all, are rarely accorded any social significance." That's really important. What it means is that we can fly under the radar. Those enormous forces, those enormous oppressive forces, ignore these small things. So a large-scale assault on the Death Star isn't going to work, but a small fighter can go in and penetrate the defenses. So what we've got here is we've got the small fighter penetrating the defenses of the Death Star because it's not going to be noticed.
It also reminds me a little bit of the end of the Soviet Union. The people sort of making fun of the leaders, right? You could just have a joke at the expense of the leaders is a small act of resistance that requires no organization and maybe has no terrible consequence as long as you're careful about it.
Right. And
But it's still an act of resistance.
it's still an act of resistance.
Yeah, but do these acts of resistance really bring about change? Do they work?
Well, so Scott says yes. So one more quote from Scott. They're individual acts of foot dragging and evasion, reinforced by a venerable popular culture of resistance, and multiplied by many thousandfold, may, in the end, make an utter shambles of the policies dreamed up by their would-be superiors in the capital. Everyday forms of resistance make no headlines, but just as millions of anthozoan polyps create, willy-nilly, a coral reef, so do the multiple acts of peasant insubordination and evasion create political and economic barrier reefs of their own.
Lovely quote. So, for example,
Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 examples of this at work, and we're going to go from older to actually current day examples of where we see this kind of weapons of the week coming into play. And the first is desertion during the U.S. Civil War, desertion by Confederate troops. And the desertion by the Confederate troops during the U.S. Civil War was enormous. As a matter of fact, Robert E. Lee said he worried that desertion just among the troops from North Carolina was so great that it would cost the South the war. So why is that? What was going on in North Carolina that caused this to happen? So here is a bit actually from my own work on this that I'm going to read while blushing. The Conscript Act of 1862 simultaneously imposed the threat of the draft on the small farmers of North Carolina, while exempting, by means of the 20 slave clause, their wealthier counterparts. That is a clause in the Conscript Act that said if you had 20 slaves or more, if you owned 20 slaves or more, you didn't have to go fight.
so explicitly exempting the children of wealthy families.
Exactly. The vast majority of those who served were small farmers and farm laborers or their sons. These men had very little, if any, economic stake in the continuance of large-scale plantation agriculture or in a slavery-based economy. They deserted at the first opportunity. Of the 120,000 North Carolinians who enlisted to fight in the Confederate Army, an estimated 12,000 deserted before the war was over. So that's 10%.
10%.
That's a lot. And it did play a role in the defeat of the South in the Civil War.
So the Army of North Carolina was decimated by desertion, you could say, exactly.
Exactly. Thank you for the correct use of the word decimated. So here's what Scott says about that. The collapse of the Confederate Army and the economy in the course of the Civil War in the United States is a further example of the decisive role of silent and undeclared defections. The Confederacy was undone by a silent avalanche of petty acts of insubordination carried out by an unlikely coalition of slaves and yeomen, a coalition with no name, no organization, no leadership, and certainly no Leninist conspiracy behind it. It's sort of interesting to me that the descendants of these people, of the deserters from the Confederate Army, now are part of the army of, they're the foot soldiers in the army of fascism that we see sweeping across the United States. Certainly their ancestors knew better than that and knew who the real enemy was. Tragically, that's not true today. So that was the first example. That's desertion. For the second example, I want to talk about a technique called work to rule. Work to rule is where workers do exactly what the regulations at their place of work say that they should do. And as anyone who's ever had a job that has regulations knows, this can cause complete and utter chaos. It can shut things down. Because in order to make organizations work, we all have to use our own human ingenuity, and we have to know how to make the goal happen without necessarily following the letter of the law when it comes to regulations. So I'm going to give 2 examples from Europe of workers using the work to rule technique to protest against what's happening to them. The first is the French railway system, where it is against the law for French railway workers to strike. But One French law requires engineers to assure that the safety of every bridge they go over. They have to inspect the bridge, and if they have any question, the engineer of the train has to do that. And if they have any question about the safety of the bridge, they have to get the rest of the train crew to come and discuss this together and make a group decision of this. So what the French railway workers did, instead of striking, which they were not allowed to do by law, was every single time a train went across a bridge, the engineer got out, he inspected the bridge, he called all the other workers, they all discussed it. None of the trains got to their destination anything close to being on time.
I just love the image of a committee forming at the edge of the bridge, everyone stopping to smoke a cigarette, have a coffee, talk about the construction of the bridge.
Right, exactly. But it is, in fact, the letter of the law. They're following the letter of the law. The second one is about Austrian postal workers who had demands. They didn't want to lose their jobs. But according to regulations, what they're supposed to do is after they've accepted all the letters and things, every letter is supposed to be weighed to make sure that it's not overweight for the amount of postage affixed to it. Normally, you can pick up a letter, you can say, this isn't too heavy, throw it in the bins, it gets sent on to be sorted. But instead, the Austrian postal workers took every single piece of mail, one by one, to the weighing machine. This is after they'd been stamped and everything, to the weighing machine to check and make sure that they were not overweight, even things that were obviously not overweight, because the regulations say it's supposed to be weighed. So within one day, the Austrian post office was stacked with backed up enormously. So those are two examples of people using work to rule to put a spanner in the works, as we say, to make their point that human ingenuity is important for an organization to function. Don't mess with the people who are the ones who are using that human ingenuity, because they have the ability to stop using it and instead follow the rules, and then everything will fall to pieces. So that's something called work to rule. Then the third example is something actually that you mentioned to me the other day when we were talking about this, called feigned incompetence. And you ran across something on your social media feed that was exactly this.
Absolutely. So on Mastodon, someone was pointing out, because of the recent rightward shift of the leader of Meta, the parent organization of Facebook, that a lot of Meta employees are frustrated, thinking about quitting, and in addition, of course, to people in the public thinking about stopping using Facebook and other Meta family services. So this was a post someone put on Mastodon, and someone says, "Meta employees, let me rap at you a minute. Sure, you can always quit, as we like to say around here, but at this crucial juncture, you can both protect your own livelihood and do so much more good for the world by not quitting. That's right, don't quit, just stop working. Show up every day, don't complain, don't draw attention to yourself, but don't accomplish anything. If you're working on a project, commit in your heart to never finishing it. This will be your last project at Meta, and you will be working on it until they force you out. If others rely on you to get their work done, make sure they can't. If your role involves reviewing pull requests, you and I both know you can find a reason to reject every one. In fact, wouldn't it be fun to see how many other employees you can drive out first? If you work in an open office space, make sure you chew loudly at all times. Microwave fish in the break room every single day. Be creative. You have plenty of time to think of ideas with all the work you're not getting done."
So that's a current situation, right? And that is feigned incompetence, right? Make sure that the thing you're doing never gets done. So if Meta workers all engaged in this feigned incompetence, that would be the end of that. So these are the sorts of things that we're talking about when we're talking about weapons of the week. They're small things. They can be done individually, these small acts of resistance. But all together, as Scott says, these small acts build up giant reefs of resistance.
I love the way you brought that across such a long time span. One imagines the railway workers and the postal workers and the folks working in rice fields, and then this example of a very modern, torn from the headlines example of Meta. So it's a technique that seems to be applicable in many, many different contexts, and all of us can find a way to do that if that's our most powerful and effective, you and Scott are telling us, way of acting in whatever context we're working.
Right. So it's not to say that large-scale organization is not important. Certainly it is. It's not to say that organizations like the ACLU are not important. Certainly they are. But on an individual daily basis, there are things we can do even when we feel disempowered. And I think it's interesting to see that we're not the first people to ever face this problem. And we have a lot of lessons to learn from people who've been dealing with oppression all over the globe for a long, long time. There are things to learn by looking at these examples.
All right, so what can we do?
Well, the first thing to say is there aren't specific prescriptions for this because we all have to look around and see what is the thing that we could do that would, as I said, put a spanner in the works. So that's number one. Look for opportunities to gum up the works. It may be through feigned incompetence. It may be through work to rule. It may be through petty pilfering. These sorts of things that can really slow down organizations that are part of some sort of oppressive machinery. The point is, you know best what that thing may be because you're the person in that situation. If you're working in an office, you know where the choke point is. You know where the point is, where this is a place where the overlords can't do this, can't make something happen. That's the place to attack, but only you know what that is. The second thing is something that you mentioned, which is make fun of them. Humor is an incredible means for bringing down the high and mighty. One of the things that the agricultural laborers in Sadaka used was jokes and stories and things to make fun of the landlords. An interesting thing about that is landlords or people in power really can't punish that too much because it exposes how tenuous their control is, what hollow balloons they really are. So prick those balloons. They don't dare let you know how much that mattered, but it does.
And I have to say that sounds like it keeps us energized to have a little bit of fun as we're resisting fascism.
Absolutely, and that's a really important thing, that this resistance should be joyous resistance whenever possible. The third thing is read banned books, especially at the library. Get a library card and use it. Request those books. Because one of the most important things of fascism is cutting down on people's ability to access information. We need that. We need that communication. And so bans are meant to silence voices that are critical, and it's meant to keep us ignorant and isolated. So read banned books, especially if you can read them in a library. Get a library card. Everyone who gets a library card, that's support for the library. Use your libraries. Do that.
You know, there's also an online kind of library-like creation, which is one of the greatest things in the modern world, which is Wikipedia. It's under attack right now, but from oligarchs, because they don't like the spread of actual, useful, collectively created information. But read Wikipedia and support Wikipedia is a small thing you can do that will, in the same way as reading banned books, keep you informed and support the resistance.
Absolutely. And then the final thing, the fourth thing, is don't comply, and certainly don't comply in advance. Wait to be asked to hand over your rights, and then don't. Drag your feet. Don't do it. So we see a rush right now of people rushing to comply in advance because they're scared of what will happen to them if they don't. Don't comply, and don't comply in advance. But instead of saying, I'm not going to comply, say, yeah, I'm getting to that any minute now. It'll be done any minute now. That's what Scott would call the weapons of the week.
Thank you. That gives me things to do, or not do carefully.
Not to. So if you're interested in finding out more about this, on our website, therevolutionwillnotbetelevised.net, we have a list of resources and more information is available there.